My name is Elizabeth Janzen, and I'm the Assistant Professor of Flute at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. This video is part of a series of mini lessons designed to highlight practice techniques and approaches that can help you better prepare for the 2014 Texas All-State auditions on the flute. Today we're going to take a look at the second Etude, number 35 in B-flat minor by Karg-Elert, and how scale patterns can help you perfect this very difficult piece of music. As flutists, we're often asked to prepare material that is very fast and technically challenging. If we're lucky, that material is based on scale patterns, because ideally we're already practicing those patterns as part of our routine warm-up. In the case of this study, the most commonly used patterns are from the chromatic scale. Unfortunately, it's often grouped in a different way or in a variation of the typical F 1 or 2 octave chromatic scale that most of us are accustomed to seeing in our band classes. So we need to find a way to practice these variations on that pattern so that we feel comfortable working this etude up to speed. My first piece of advice is to sit down with a pencil and mark all of the chromatic patterns that you can find in this etude. I think you'll be surprised once they're marked to find out just how much of this etude is in fact just part of a chromatic scale. There are 3 versions of the chromatic scale that you can find. The first is the most common, the 4 chromatic notes followed by an interval leap. And there's 2 examples of this right at the beginning of the etude. The next version is a little longer, a little bit more similar to the 1 octave chromatic scale you might be familiar with. For example, at the beginning of the second bar, or in the middle of the 8th bar. And then the third version of the chromatic scale features a change in direction. So for example, at the end of the first bar, the chromatic scale begins in a descent, but then goes in the opposite direction, ascending. By marking all of these patterns, you give yourself the opportunity to reduce the information that you're trying to interpret on the page. This is a very difficult key signature, and there are a lot of accidentals, and the writing is very heavy because of the 32nd note patterns. But that information isn't something that you need to interpret for every note if you have your patterns marked. If you use square brackets marking the first note of the pattern towards the last note of the pattern, all you have to identify as you're playing is that now I'm about to play a chromatic pattern. It starts on this note and I need to finish it on this note. And that helps facilitate the reading of this exercise, both as you're learning, but also as you're performing it in a stressful situation like an audition. Now, in addition to chromatic patterns, there are 2 other scale patterns that I think it would be a good idea to be familiar with, because they'll help you with some of the more awkward sections. The first are dominant 7th arpeggios. These are very similar to our regular major arpeggios that we practice every day. But in a dominant 7th arpeggio, instead of going up to the tonic, you finish the arpeggio with a minor 3rd on top of the dominant. So let me break that down a little bit. Let's use C major as an example. C major arpeggio is composed of C, E, G, and then we put another C on top. In a dominant 7th arpeggio beginning on C, we play C, E, G. So far it's exactly the same as a major arpeggio. But on the top of the G, we put a B flat, so a minor 3rd above the G. It sounds like this. And you can practice these arpeggios just like you do regular arpeggios. That was a simple form of the arpeggio that I just played, where you go up and then descend directly. You can also practice them as overlapping arpeggios, which sound like this. And these are especially useful in this study because The arpeggios usually don't occur in root position, in that basic first position that we explored in the simple arpeggio. For example, there's a dominant 7th arpeggio outlined at the beginning of the 8th bar, but it's not in root position. It doesn't start on the bass note of the arpeggio, which is in fact the A flat. So if you wrote it in the bass position with the major triad and then the minor third on top, you'd start with the A flat, then you'd have C, then you'd have E flat, and then G flat gives you the minor third. So it would sound like this. Instead, it's written with the E flat on the bottom, but it still proceeds through the same notes. So by practicing your overlapping versions of these arpeggios, you're helping your fingers to memorize some of these patterns that they're going to come across anyways in the study. And you'll have to think less about the individual notes that you're playing and be able to rely more on your muscle memory by practicing these arpeggios. The other arpeggio version that is featured in this study are the diminished 7th arpeggios. They don't appear as frequently, but I think it's a good idea to be familiar with these as well. Basically, a diminished 7th arpeggio is a string of minor thirds, and they're a really interesting harmony because they divide the 12 chromatic notes evenly into 4. So again, if we're starting on C, we'll have C, and then E flat, and then G flat, and then B double flat, which can also be spelled as A natural. And it sounds like this. Now you can play that in a simple version like I just did, like a regular arpeggio, or like the dominant 7ths, you can also play these as overlapping. And also like the dominant 7ths in this study, they usually don't occur in that bass position. So I think it would be a good idea to explore that. There's a diminished 7th arpeggio in the 6th bar underneath the 3rd slur. You'll see it written as a D flat, descending to a G natural, descending to an E natural, descending to a B flat. And if you respell that and work through it backwards, starting on the E, you have E, going to a minor third G natural, going to a minor third B flat, going to a minor third D flat. So it will sound like this. So to summarize, this study isn't nearly as hard as it looks. It looks difficult because you see a lot of black on the page. The 32nd notes, the 5 flats, a lot of accidentals. But those are all based in patterns that you're already familiar with, or patterns that are easy to figure out and practice on your own in your warm-up. So when you're practicing this piece, really make sure to make the effort to include these arpeggios and chromatic exercises in your warm-up so that you're already prepared with these patterns in your fingers before you even try to play the piece. And you'll discover very quickly it's much easier to work it up to speed when your fingers are ahead of your brain. Good luck and happy practicing.